All right. Well, welcome everyone to today's Nonprofit Hive LinkedIn Live session. Really excited to have you all here for today's conversation, whether you're here live or watching the replay later on. Today's topic is building trust in the nonprofit sector, reversing the decline. I am Dan Drucker, founder of Philanthropy Fuel, where I work with nonprofits to build better partnerships. I'm also a very, very, very proud Hive ambassador and want to sincerely thank Tasha for trusting me to facilitate this important dialogue today. And I know that she's going to be crazy active in the chat, and I hope the rest of you are too, because that's what makes these forums so valuable. You've all got so much to share. So let's start firing up the chat by letting us know where you're from and what organization you're with. And while you're doing that, and before we dive in, we'd like to really thank our session sponsor. Liminal is a creative agency that helps nonprofits clarify their message, raise more money, expand their impact. From brand strategy to websites and campaigns, Liminal brings bold ideas to life. And if you know me and you follow my content, you know that I'm a big, big, big proponent of nonprofits being unapologetically bold. So great job to Liminal. Learn more about them at meetliminal.com, and please check them out. They're a fantastic organization. Today, we're diving into a hard but crucial topic, trust. The nonprofit sector is not immune to an overall erosion of trust in institutions. So what's behind the drop in trust? And more importantly, what can we do about it? Those are some of the issues we're going to tackle today. I am joined by an incredible panel that's going to help us answer some of those questions. Incredible nonprofit leaders who bring bold ideas and lived experiences to this conversation. So without further ado, let's get to know them a bit. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to talk about what you do, and probably more importantly, what drew you to this particular conversation. And first up, Bobby James, the founder of James's Connections.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Dan, and thanks to Tasha and the Nonprofit Hive for this opportunity. James's Connections is a nonprofit that supports other nonprofits by bridging the gap between for-profit and nonprofit organizations, creating community awareness, connecting them to education and resources. And we also manage events to helping create philanthropic efforts for small nonprofits. And what drew me to this conversation is through my lived experience, I do see where there is lack of trust. And so I think it's important for us to rebuild that trust, because the nonprofit sector is very essential in our economy and in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bobby. Next up, let's go to Dr. Angie Holzer, the founder of Wiki Charities.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be here. So I run a company or a nonprofit called Wiki Charities. We are the largest open access global database of nonprofits in the world. And really, I launched this 4 or 5 years ago based on my research in trust and transparency. So I'm excited to share that a little later. And really, I launched Wiki Charities because there was an ongoing awareness that smaller to medium-sized nonprofits were not getting a lot of resources, a lot of that due to lack of trust. And so we've been working at Wiki Charities to kind of bridge that gap. So I'm excited to talk about it. Thank you.
Awesome. And finally, last but not least, a guy I've known now in this sector for a while and have the pleasure of learning what he's all about is Courtney Harness, who's the Director of Strategic Advancement at the Vermont Association for Mental Health and Addiction Recovery. Courtney?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And to echo Bobby and Angie, just super thankful for the opportunity. Do want to say it's really nice to not have to say my whole title and organization.
I thought I'd save you some time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, 20 years in nonprofit work, I've been through a lot, whether that's the recession and how we're all going to change and then don't, and then COVID and how we're all going to change, and then how fast can we get back to normal. And so from working inside of it and playing the role of fundraiser and relationship builder and connector, where you're having to straddle this line of organizational statements and reality. How do we make sure actions align with rhetoric, and in particular with our communities, in our communities, and with our funders, donors, and supporters, and what we see happen. And I'm really excited to hear more about Angie's research. Obviously, what we see happen is when actions don't align with rhetoric, trust starts to deteriorate. And doesn't matter what your candid seal is, doesn't matter how many people you serve. It's really hard to scratch and claw back from it. So I'm excited to share some of my experience that is just my own, and see what everyone else has to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Wow, we have got a tremendous panel today, and I was just checking out the chat. We've got people from all over, but certainly a heavy bent towards Canada and the Eastern U.S., which is not that surprising. So welcome, everyone. Let's dive into question number one. No reason to delay. The main question is, why is trust in nonprofits declining? And I'd say, we're hearing more skepticism from donors, from volunteers, from communities, from partners. For our panelists, what do you think is fueling this erosion of trust? And where do you see the biggest disconnect between how nonprofits see themselves and how the public sees them? And we'll start with Bobby and then go to Courtney and then Angie.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dan. And in my experience, I think it starts with lack of education, just understanding the core of where nonprofits start and understanding who they are and what their purpose. I hear too many times that nonprofits don't even recognize themselves as being a business. So if you don't even understand who you are or why you've started this nonprofit, how can you truly engage in the industry with building full trust, right? If you don't completely understand who you are. So to not cover the whole conversation, my beginning statement is about education and misunderstanding within the community, within the funders, within the nonprofit sector itself about who we really are and our purpose.
Awesome. Angie?
Yeah, so I'll actually share a little bit about some of the research we've been doing and our team about the latest research in the last 5 or 10 years on what it means for trust on both the side of the nonprofit as well as the funder. But there's 3 things I wrote down that I wanted to share. That trust is deeply influenced by leadership humility, which is very interesting. Local engagement, how engaged are you in the local community that you currently are? And I think it leads to partnerships when we think about that. And then the third element I wanted to mention was clear communication, which I think leads to transparency, which we'll talk about a little later. But the importance of taking it from the perspective of the funder, and this will be published, so I'm happy to send it out, but I just wrote down, when funders move away from rigid grant requirements and instead engage in open dialogue with nonprofits, they build the trust. And then not only that, they share the power, which is, I think a few months ago, Nonprofit Hive did something which I actually loved, a conversation about the imbalance of power between funders and nonprofits. So I just think it's really important to recognize that there's trust that needs to be, both sides play a part into trust and what we both can do.
That's awesome. I mean, I think 2 things you hit on there that were just huge. One is, how close are you, your nonprofit, to the community? I don't think organizations necessarily grasp that their closeness to the community is probably the key thing in building trust. And for that to grow, you've got to show that you're engaged and you're listening to them and they're part of the solution. And the second piece I thought was wonderful, Angie, was funders play a role in this. Let's not forget, let's not lay everything on the nonprofit organization, right? Funders play a role. We could talk all day about restricted versus non-restricted, but the more they believe in and support and use the credibility and expertise in the nonprofits, the more, like you said, they share the trust, which is wonderful. And I think part of that issue is something that Bobby said, which is a lot of nonprofits don't see themselves as a business, which since I joined this sector has driven me crazy. I'm like, nonprofit is a tax status. That's all it is. You are a business. You're not the same kind of business as a corporation, but you're a business. So I think those things all combine to create some issues that a lot of nonprofit organizations don't even realize are being created by what they're doing. So great points. Let's throw it over now to Courtney. Why is nonprofit trust declining, and how do we reverse it?
Yeah, I think this is going to be some truth telling here, and so it might hurt some feelings, but I'm part of the piece of it. As a sector, and I'm not going to say every single person, but I think most of us, particularly in the last 20 years, have not held ourselves accountable to our rhetoric. And when we don't hold ourselves accountable to our rhetoric, particularly with hyper local organizations, our communities hear us say things, and then the things that we do don't match up with what we say. And whenever that happens, it doesn't matter if you're a business, if you're a nonprofit, if you're in a relationship, which we all are with funders, trust starts to erode because what we say and what we do don't match up. It causes confusion internally, externally. And then on the funder side, I want to talk about something that we think is really great. And I will start by saying what a wonderful gift and blessing to get $10 million, $18 million, $20 million from Mackenzie Scott. I think it's phenomenal. And if we start to dig into the research, how many of those organizations have laid people off in the last year or 2 years? I know at least 10 off the top of my head personally. And so how do we keep trust with funders when we say we need money and we get the money and we don't do what we say we're going to do with the money? So on both sides of it, for me, it's what we say we need and then what we say we do. And then our actions don't align with either of them. And so I've been saying a lot recently, we need to be the change. We have to role model that accountability, no matter how hard it is, no matter how much we want to say things and put out statements. If what you do doesn't align with what you say, don't say it. And I think it starts there.
I think that's great. I think at Courtney, we're here for the raw honesty, and I think these are things that have got to be said. It's things that everybody else is thinking. By the way, I saw a comment. One of my favorite comments in the chats is from Tim Turner. He said, "Even today, 24 years later, I did not know what I did not know," and that is just so true for all of us. It sums it up. I read something last few weeks, and I apologize to whoever authored it. I don't remember if it was on LinkedIn or somewhere else, and I can't remember who did it, so I can't give credit, but it was great. It said, trust isn't a given. It's a renewable resource. And when it's running low, we can't just explain harder. We can't just talk more. We have to rebuild, re-earn, and re-engage. And that kind of weaves in to what the three of you were saying in terms of how we have to constantly earn it and how it's kind of it's a moving target. It's not an absolute. It's not a one-time say, trust me or prove something. You got to keep delivering. And like you said, Courtney, doing exactly what you said. So great discussion to set it up on why is trust declining and what can we do to reverse it. So now we move on to something that, Angie already mentioned, which is what does transparency actually look like? Transparency is one of those buzzwords, right? Everybody agrees with it. We should be transparent, of course, but few really define it effectively. And what does it really look like in your work? I'll ask our panelists. And where's the line between kind of honesty and sharing versus kind of overwhelm and TMI, to be honest? And how does ethical storytelling potentially play into that? So I will throw it over to Angie first, and then we'll go to Bobby and then Courtney.
Yeah, so really a lot that we do is based off of all the research that shows trust and transparency, call it a chicken or egg. One comes from for the other, but they work very closely together, which leads to better outcomes through partnerships and whatnot. So a lot of the research, going back to our research, a lot of research shows that when people or nonprofits are more transparent, better outcomes. But they also show that how you're transparent matters. So simply being transparent with your plans or your reporting, just to put it out there, actually shows that trust declines unless you involve impact reports, right? How you're impacting and your recent study also showed your intention matters. If you're simply just posting it out there to show that you're being transparent, but you're not utilizing that data to make change, and this is a phrase that I wrote down that I thought was important. We need to embrace a culture of learning and reflection. So there's so much research shows that when nonprofits they share their limitations, their challenges, and their risks, because sometimes we're hesitant to share the challenges, it actually increases trust. So the more transparent we are in real conversations, which is I like what the other two panelists have mentioned, right? The more real we can be, the funders actually trust you more, which leads to more resources, more support. And so Anyway, we feel very strongly about the importance of transparency, and I think financials is where a lot of our minds go, which is very important on how we share the financials. But we need to recognize that sharing the impact data and then showing that we're using it to improve are important. A lot to unpack there, but I wanted to kind of mention a lot of that.
So Angie, when you mentioned, if you just throw it out there to get it done, it actually could erode trust. I mean, is that similar to organizations, whether nonprofits or for-profits, that kind of are seen as just throwing something out there for DEI, like, a post about, whatever the month is or whatever that special day is, but don't have anything behind it, actually hurts them in the long run rather than helps them. Is that a similar phenomenon?
Yes, absolutely. I think the funders that want to be engaged longer term, they can recognize, I think, you just throwing things out there and not being able to be honest about your challenges or how you're using the data or the growth, right? Your growth and learning and reflection. I think the movement on both sides, as we discussed, need to be able to have a mindset of discussing challenges. Trust improves by doing that, and then thus outcomes improve for that. So I do think it's a responsibility on both ends to have those honest conversations that leads to a better space.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great stuff. This research is going to be amazing. Looking forward to it. Bobby, thoughts on transparency?
Yes, very well said, Angie. And for me, in my experience, what I have witnessed, I just really feel that there's a lot of fear, right? Mm-hmm. And on one end, it's about, I got to say the right things, like you're saying, Angie, you got to display the right things, and afraid to show the struggles and the challenge, or telling it in a story where it's a sob story because you're trying to frame it in a way that gets the funding. Mm-hmm. And so kind of piggybacking on what I said earlier about the lack of trust in the education component, right? Of really helping people understand what your challenges are and why they are there, and understanding that being transparent and vulnerable can be the most powerful thing that you ever do, right? When we are when we're afraid to fail, we lose that beautiful opportunity to teach others of, hey, this is how I messed up. That's one of the formats to which Jam Connections leads by. Mm. Anything that I've done, successfully or not, I'm so willing to be transparent in sharing it, because I'm hopeful that maybe my failure helps you to not stumble across that and do better, right? So when we're willing to be collaborative and share and be transparent in that way, too often what I find is when people are trying to live in the business world from the for-profit side, where, hey, got to keep this close to my chest, I don't want to be transparent in telling you who I am and what I'm doing. We're in a space of service. And the more we can share who we are and what we do in that transparency, we're helping more people, right? And when we don't put ourselves in these silos, to me, that's not being transparent, because we're afraid to be real. But when we're real, we're helping more people, in my opinion. And that's where the power of transparency really lives and can build for the greater good, if you will.
Well, if I can jump in here real quick, Bobby, you mentioned earlier, too many nonprofits don't see them as organizations or businesses. I do think there's a difference between the mindset of a for-profit organization, to your point. There's this hesitancy of sharing because there's competition. And I recently had a board meeting, and this was a type of conversation where people coming from the for-profit space were hesitant because I had a community meeting discussing this collaborative effort. But to your point, it's different. People that work in the nonprofit sector are very service oriented, and should be moving into the space of less competition to make an impact, right? So I do think there's a difference between an organization living in the for-profit space of competitiveness and the nonprofit sector. I think we need to learn how to move out of competition and move into collaborative efforts. Anyway, I wanted to add that.
I
Thanks.
agree with that. As somebody who spent 35 years in corporate B2B, I can tell you the paranoia is real and rampant and prevalent.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for my former employers, I was not born with a filter, so I didn't always adhere to those that way. But, I'd rather be transparent. It's a lot easier.
Yeah.
It takes a lot less effort just to be yourself. Courtney,
Absolutely.
I know you've got a lot to say on transparency and you've been talking about it.
Yeah.
So what do you got for us?
A whole lot. And first I want to say, Angie, right on. Impact reports, financials, all of that stuff. And here's what I think transparency could look like, but doesn't most of the time. Most of the time it's, here's our impact report. Look at all of these activities. We did such a great job last year. We're so proud of it. Everyone should be so proud of us. Look at how great we are. And the same week, we're saying, we need your money. Give us your money. We have to have more. We have to have funding for this. And so that's an example of, even in just rhetoric, like your messaging has to align. It's okay to say, to be proud of your impact. I think we should all be proud of our impact, no matter how big or small our service is. And make sure the impact report is telling the story of the gap that exists or what you could do if you had more, right? And so I think sometimes that's what we miss on impact reports and transparency. We served 100 people and here are the outcomes. And if we had this much more money, here's what we could have done. Or this many more partners. And I think it's just that extra little layer. And I want to give an example from my career and also say this is, I said I've been doing this 20 years. So this is one time that it happened well in 20 years. So I don't want to make myself out to be someone that does it right all the time. But about 10 years ago, we wrote to a family foundation in Minneapolis for a 3-year grant to serve young people with the YMCA. And we got the grant and we were about halfway through the first year and realized that we weren't even going to come close to what we told them we were going to do in year one. Not a chance. And so we went through the whole, dog and pony show with the site visit of the ED of the foundation. It was great. Put on it to the busiest site, best site, super happy, sit in the room after. And I say, so we're going to do what we told you we were going to do by the end of 3 years. But the first year, we're not even going to come close. And what we thought we were ready for, we weren't. This is capacity building. And if we want this to turn into a long-term sustainable initiative, we have a little bit of work to do in the off season, so to speak. And you can kind of see this look come over the person's face of like, wow, this is a little different because what I saw was this is really fantastic and this is great. And now we're hearing, hey, we told you this, we might not get there. We'll get there in 3 years. Long story short, it was okay. And the program was funded in perpetuity at the end of 3 years. So that little bit of sharing helped us become closer as partners in the work, helped us become closer in, I don't know what I don't know. Here's the challenge specifically that we're working on. And how do we leverage other human capital, not financial capital, to solve some of those challenges? And it was just a really, really good outcome. I had another one recently, actually last month, with a funder in my current role. They said, hey, write us a proposal for this. And so we write it. And then my boss and I say, we could get this money, but this isn't going to work. Like, we'll do it. We can get the money. So we sit on the call with the rep from the foundation, and we both said at the same time, one on top of the other, this isn't the best way to do it. We'll do it. If you want to pay us to do it, we'll do it. But it's not going to have the outcome that you want it to have. This needs to be slower. We need to build relationships. We need to build trust. And this needs to take a year, not a month. And it was a great, again, I think that vulnerability, that transparency by us saying we need to bring more people in to the work, Angie, to your point, really was also real because it's just how we do the work as well. And so just a couple of real life examples, but I do think it has to be so collaborative, even internally in the organization across departments. And it really makes a difference when you show up. When you say you messed up or you didn't do what you said you were going to do, but you're going to try to make it right.
Yeah.
The reality is that's a really good trust builder.
So I want to just connect the dots there. So the examples you just gave, in my mind, represent leadership humility. Like, you are right. I mean, it's just and trust skyrockets when you do that, but you're in a vulnerable space. And then I wanted to comment on Monte's, I think the comment, he said it's hard for startups or nonprofits to show that impact. And I am such a believer, I hope to do a research study to show this, that small to medium-sized nonprofits that aren't the ones that are getting those funding make such a different type of impact than larger organizations. They're the ones in these small communities around the world. But they don't have the numbers, right? So it's the hope, I think, us educating the sector to say, just because the numbers are lower of your impact, does not mean it's less than, it's different. And sometimes that smaller nonprofit can reach places that larger ones cannot reach. So to Monte's point, it is hard, and hopefully we can change the mindset in that space.
I think that is such a great point. Small nonprofit, there's no question. We can't sugarcoat it. They don't have the resources of a large global brand name nonprofit.
Yep.
There's another question there. What do we do now? We don't have USAID anymore, and there's no easy answer to that if you've lost thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars in aid. But I do think small nonprofits have to embrace the advantages they do have. And Angie, you touched on that. They're closer to the community.
Yep.
And that builds trust. So play on that trust. Mobilize your supporters. So maybe it's not going to come from a government, but maybe there's businesses out there that want to support that. Maybe there's individual donors, and maybe it's not financial right away. Maybe there's volunteering or advocacy or just helping with ideas and solutions. So I think I just triggered something there. And Bobby, go ahead, Bobby.
You did. Great conversation, guys. And I would say for those small nonprofits, that's one that we are as well. That's where collaboration comes in and is so powerful. But Angie, you make such an amazing point in that when you're starting out or you're small, sometimes you don't even know.
Yep.
Someone said, I don't even know what I didn't know after so many years, right? You don't even know the resources out there because you don't have the time or the resources to do the research. And so if we can continue to change the mindset and help people understand the power of collaboration, that gives you more access, to things you weren't aware of. And so one of the things, as I shared with you guys, what we do is connect people to resources. I love meeting with all sorts of individuals on the for-profit and nonprofit side, because I get to learn what's available out there so that we can share with those nonprofits what resources are available. So for anyone that is a small nonprofit, I encourage you to reach out to your community, build those relationships, look to other nonprofits doing what you do, or nonprofits that you admire doing great work and having success, to see if they're willing to collaborate with you, to mentor you, because it does take community to have that success.
And, Bobby, that's such a good point. I know we have more questions, but I was just at an all-day conference yesterday, and the last session of the day was around collaboration. And I said, fundamentally, one thing we do is say we need more money, and then when we get it, we don't know what to do with it. So what it really looks like, transparency in practice, is saying, if we're a $1 million nonprofit and we get a $10 million gift, we don't know what to do. We have the capacity, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the reach. And so I would tell small nonprofits, be prepared, because you don't know ever. And I think Mackenzie Scott and others are really good examples of that. You don't know who's looking at your organization thinking you're the best thing ever, ready to give you 15 mil for you to not know what to do with it. So we went through 90 minutes yesterday, and at the end, it was a really good conversation, complaining a lot about the system and everything else. And I said, here's the deal, right? Like, we're in the state of Vermont. If a funder in Vermont comes to us and says, I got $100 million to solve homelessness in Vermont, give me your plan. What is it? And we don't have one. And I think that's okay too, to say we don't have a plan even if we did have the money. So that's the actions and the rhetoric piece too, right? We can't be out there saying that we can change the world if only we had the money and we're underfunded and under-resourced and undervalued and overworked and overstressed. but then not be able to answer what we would do if we had the money. What's the plan? Be ready, because someday we'll get the money. And when you get the money, be ready to put it into play. I think that's something I see all the time, especially with small nonprofits, is out there asking, and it's like the dog that caught the car, right? So.
Well, so it popped up there. What does scale look like in the nonprofit sector? And as you're talking, I'm just thinking, I think an acknowledgement for me, because I work with a lot of small nonprofits around the world, is I don't think necessarily their goal should be to scale large, spread across all of Africa. Maybe you're right. So, but be sustainable and create, definitely, I think be ready for if funding does come, but to scale. And I think maybe there's a definition of scaling, but I don't think every nonprofit needs to be known globally, right? Maybe they just perfect what they're doing in that space. And I think resource providers, be it funders or supporters, need to, I think, support that idea that maybe they don't want to be a multi-million-dollar nonprofit, that they can perfect what they do in their space. And then maybe we, as Bobby, we provide resources to share what they're doing to then impact and help other nonprofits do what they're doing. But maybe to scale isn't their goal, which seems to be the for-profit world, right? But in the nonprofit world, they're doing what they do really well in their community, and maybe they're satisfied with that.
Yeah, I interviewed an executive director a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions I posed was, if you got a $1 million and it's a small nonprofit, you got a $1 million unrestricted gift tomorrow morning, what would you do with it? And his first thing said, well, that would warrant a live thank you visit. So I'm glad to hear that. But the second thing he said, probably nothing. We'd probably put it into endowment and be happy that we had it, and it would give us the peace of mind. Yep. He goes, but you can't shift gears and all of a sudden try to grow and do different things. Now, as we're having strategy sessions about what we could do over the next 5 years, knowing we have that money, we may decide to do a couple different things. But you don't pivot on a dime just because you got the money. And I don't think scaling is necessarily the answer. I think how can you keep serving the people you're serving better and deeper is probably a better way to look at it.
I like it. Yep.
Awesome conversation. So we are at the halfway point. Just quick reminders, the chat seems to be doing great. There's a lot going on, so keep it going. If you have a question, drop it in the chat. We'll try to get to it. If you got stories to share that kind of back up what we're talking about, drop those in, because we're learning from each other, not just from the people on camera here. So this was interesting because I kind of feel like what you're all talking about says that trust is built more from how we communicate than what we say. And I also think, kind of a PSA to nonprofits, small and large. I know you've all got, comms and marketing, well, maybe not marketing departments if you're small, but a marketing plan and everything. But I got to say, like, messy, uncensored, unfiltered probably builds trust better than marketing glitzy and shiny. So just my opinion, but I think we spend too much time, especially with all the technology out there and social media, trying to make it perfect and Academy Award worthy when people just want to see the raw behind the scenes stuff from the people that matter. So just as a little PSA. So let's go to the next topic, which is trust starts on the inside, which in and of itself is not a question, but what we want to talk about is how does internal culture, so things like leadership, communication, staff inclusion, shape how much the outside world trusts your organization. And for our panel, have you seen examples where internal misalignment hurt external relationships? Or if we want to look at it more of a glass half full, where strong internal trust created deeper community connection? Because I can tell you, in my experience in both for-profit and nonprofit, external trust almost always mirrored internal trust, for better or for worse. So let's start with Courtney on that, who I know has been writing about this ad nauseum with some super content. And before I forget, if you guys are not following our panelists on LinkedIn, you're going to have major FOMO. So I would say go do that because they put out really good insights, really good content. So absolutely follow them. But Courtney, I know this has been a hot button for you, so I'll go with you first, and then we'll follow up with Angie and Bobby.
Yeah, I think for me, to start with values and then some examples of those. And I love how Angie said humility in leadership. And I think too, vulnerability in leadership and role modeling vulnerability and building trust. And building trust isn't icebreakers, but building trust can be how do we start off internally with our team talking about things or being vulnerable and sharing things so that people feel safe in a space that helps us create trust. And so I can bookend my career with these, how I started and then where I'm at right now. It's how I learned. So the CEO at the first nonprofit I ever worked at, when I didn't even know I was working in nonprofit yet, was the CEO that was at the Y. He was taking spin class, teaching a yoga class. He was leading youth development programs, and he was super busy. But he told community, this is what we're going to do. This is important. These programs for these young people are too important to not be the highest quality. And when he was out in the community making plans and talking about young people, he had their voice. He had trust with them. He was a school teacher, so he came from this environment of being able to walk the walk with young people and with funders, and then bring people into it for all of the stuff that we can't do the stuff that we're really good at and partner for the rest of it. And he role modeled that, and it built internal trust because we saw him every day walking the walk, role modeling the mission, creating safe spaces, traveling, and having really important conversations. And then I just gave an example of my boss now, our ED at Vamhar now. He's a really, really great collaborator, and he's a really, really humble leader. And he has no problem saying, hey, I might have dropped this, or hey, I think maybe I miscommunicated this, or I can't seem to get to the solution on this. Let's bring a couple people in and try to solve it. But I also see him all the time in action with funders saying, we can't do what we do well if this other organization doesn't do what they do well. So we count on the ecosystem of nonprofits to all perform at a high level so that what we do matters. And I don't know that we always see that external voice or that voice out into the community saying, yeah, we need money too. And what we do is great, but what we do is only great because of these other 15 organizations. Like what we do doesn't matter if they don't exist. And I think to have those experiences as a professional are really meaningful and really important. And, I work in a really fascinating place in the mental health and addiction space where connection is huge and trust is really big. And we're all pretty open about our lived experience. And from that perspective, it's a little easier to be a humble, vulnerable role model of a leader when you've had some tough stuff to go through and you've had to lean on other people in your personal life, when you've had to depend on support and you've had to ask for help, things that are really hard for professionals to do. I would say look to leaders in this space, in this mental health and addiction space. Look to those leaders because they have a tendency through their lived experience to be able to role model that vulnerability and that humility really, really well. And I think that crosses the internal, external kind of gap.
That was awesome. It was a great comment also by Samantha. If managers don't trust their staff, this will eventually show up in those frontline interactions. Frontline is where organizational trust lives and dies. That is so true. I mean, if you think that stuff doesn't come out, that people don't feed off that either positively or negatively, whether you're talking about donors, prospects, the communities you serve, partners, other people in the organization, it comes out and it creates a feeling. So, organizations that don't do the right thing in terms of staff inclusion, staff trust, it's going to have an impact on more than just burnout and turnover. It's going to have an impact on everything you do. So I think that's a great point by Samantha. Angie, want to talk a little bit about this?
I was recently talking to someone, an academic in this nonprofit space in Mexico, and she said, and I wrote it down to make sure I said it right, but she said, trust is easy to lose and hard to get back, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this idea, whether you've lost the trust or you have it, but the point I guess I want to make is we have got to better understand the impact we're making in data form. And so please, 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 if you're a nonprofit, find academics in your space to help you identify so you can put that on paper. And then I would say so this is one of the research things again from our paper. It says nonprofits have been shown to be able to, they collect data, but they fail to apply it for decision making and or learning. So we have got to connect those dots of understanding our impact through data, put that somehow, you need to be able to quantify that in metrics. And then we have got to show that we're applying that data when we collect it, not just collecting it for, compliance with, but we have got to connect those dots. And then research shows that more funding, more support, better outcomes. And so I just think if there's one thing that I want this sector to do better is work better with academics that can help you understand that data and to share it. And I tell you, I go to conferences all the time in the academic space, and these are academics that are collecting the data. And then we have conversations that say, how can we share this in a way that nonprofit leaders can use and understand? So I think from both sides, it's just this world of data-driven, which needs to be, but maybe there's a misalignment or understanding, and we can probably do better of educating people on that. But those are my thoughts on that.
That makes a lot of sense. Bobby?
Awesome. Great information, guys. And I echo what you're saying. And then to kind of bring it back to just Jam's Connections and where we started, and part of being the example, I guess. Courtney, you talked about we need to be the change, right? Earlier in the conversation. When Jam's Connections first started, we actually were an organization who put on events on behalf of other nonprofits, right? At no direct cost to them. And just, I love bringing people together. And it kind of started with a health issue of my own. And I thought about, what do I love to do? I was diagnosed with cancer. I was celebrating being 10 years cancer-free. And I'm like, I want to put a concert together. And I thought, man, it would be a great thing to bring people together for connection and doing good, right? But my initial reason for starting Jam's Connections as a nonprofit is I thought, how dare I come into this industry knowing nothing about it and claim that I can declare I know what's best for you. So I wanted to go through what it felt like to start a nonprofit, the challenges, and how hard it is to build community, to raise funds. And so as we have this conversation around building trust, one of the things that I feel my mother taught me is one of the best ways to build change or create change is be the example. Not just be the change you wish to see, be the example, right? Those of you that have kids, you tell them, don't do this. But what do? They do what you do because they watch you, right? So just understand it as an organization, people may tell you what they think of you and they may not. And you may or may not know who's watching you, but people are constantly watching you, right? So that's why we need to do what we say, right? Because that builds the trust. That's what the conversation is around. And so I just simply, from my lived experience, I started Jam's Connections because I see the great work that the nonprofits do. And I saw the challenge that small nonprofits had. So I'm like, I want to be an advocate and ally to these organizations, right? And so when we start getting in conversations about nonprofits and the great work, I rarely think about Jam's Connections being a nonprofit in that space because I began it to support others, right? And so sometimes I find being vulnerable and transparent is that Jam's Connections sometimes doesn't get the support we need because we're different, right? And I'm proud to say we're different, right? How do we shake up things? I love what Tasha is doing at the nonprofit Hive. It's just having a conversation that's different than what most people are willing to do. And as leaders, if we're not willing to have those different conversations and not live the status quo, I believe that's another way to rebuild trust. When you say this is how we've always done it, but is it working? Answer that tough question. Is it working? So to me, to being transparent, to building trust, to building a community or your culture is, are you that type of leader that's willing to learn from your people? Are you that type of leader that's willing to be vulnerable and say, I don't know it all, or oops, I messed up, right? Not being afraid, right? We got in this space of service because we want to make a difference. We want to make a change. And the only way we can do that is to constantly evaluate what's working, what's not, and be willing to be the change, be the example.
And I like the idea, we're not going to get to the last question of what do you do if there's a breach of trust, but you three have touched on it several times. You got to take ownership. You've got to say, hey, I messed up. You got to be authentic and transparent, but then you've got to work hard to rebuild that trust. As Angie said, it's easy to lose, not so easy to regain. It takes some time. I read a great quote in an article a few weeks ago. I think it was the Milken Institute, and said, trust is the invisible infrastructure. So you don't even realize it's there, but it holds everything together. But you also may not see the cracks forming. And when they collapse, the whole system collapses. Everyone feels it, right? So I got to say, folks, this has been, and we're coming up towards the end of our time, this has been one of the most honest and meaningful conversations I've been part of in the nonprofit space. And it's not because we had all the answers, because we don't, but because our panelists were not afraid to name the hard stuff. And that's what this is all about. And I think if there's one thread that connects everything we heard today, it's this. Trust is not something you say. It's something you show consistently, imperfectly, a little bit messy, and over time. And I think that's the key. Thank you so much to Bobby, Courtney, and Angie for showing up today with heart and courage and all your lived experience and insights. Big thanks again to our sponsor, Liminal, for making this session possible. And thank you to everyone who joined us live and who was active in the chat. And for the folks who'll be watching later on the replay, please follow the Nonprofit Hive on LinkedIn. They put out great content. Visit the website, thenonprofithive.com, for info on upcoming events and much more. And thank you again to Tasha and the Nonprofit Hive for giving us this opportunity. Folks, let's keep having these conversations, not just to rebuild trust, but to reimagine what it could look like in this sector. Have a great day, everyone.